Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a conversation on connecting faith, climate, and justice. I'm so delighted that you're all here to join us tonight. My name is Ken Kimmell. I'm the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. UCS is an organization enjoying our 51st year, and our focus is on using the power of science and the mobilization of the scientific community to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, among them climate change, the threat of nuclear weapons, the sustainability of our food supply, and the threat that exists to science, and science playing a major role in public decision-making. Now, I've been around the block for some time now, and I have to say that 2020, I've lived through crises before, but 2020 really stands out as a year in which this country and the world have experienced 4 overlapping crises all at once. A public health crisis caused by the coronavirus, the looming crisis of climate change, the crisis of racial injustice, and the crisis of economic inequality. And underlying all of those crises is yet a 5th crisis, a knowledge crisis. When we experience as a country a deep polarization in what people consider to be truth, what people consider to be fact, what sources of information people deem to be credible and reliable. So we've been through a lot as a country this year. And fortunately, it does seem to be ending on a much more hopeful note than it started. We elected a presidential candidate who pledged to do something about all of these crises and to listen to both scientific and religious leaders in fashioning the agenda. And we see with the news of the vaccines, I'll use an unscientific term, an almost miraculously fast development of effective vaccines. But there is so much work ahead to deal with all of these intersecting crises, and we can't do it unless there is a way to bring all of us together. And that's why I'm so delighted that we have joined the faith and the science community for a conversation, and for a conversation about the role of faith, the role of science in tackling all of these big issues. I do want to say that this unity of faith and science is something that I've worked on for quite some time. A couple of years ago, Susan Hendershot and I from the Interfaith Power and Light did a tour, a faith and science tour in the 5 cities in the South. We were happy to be in Atlanta and to have Reverend Gerald Durley joining us there. And we wanted to do a whole bunch more of those conversations. We had some planned for the spring of this year, and of course, COVID got in the way. So I'm really delighted that we found a different way to keep that conversation going. So what I'd like to do now is introduce all of our speakers. We have Ibrahim Abdul-Matin. He's the author of Green Deen, What Islam Teaches Us About Protecting the Planet, and co-founder of Green Squash Consulting, a firm that works with people and institutions committed to equity and justice. We have Rabbi Melanie Aron. She is the senior rabbi of Congregation Shir Hadash. She's responsible for worship, life cycle ceremonies, pastoral care, and working with boards and volunteers. We're also delighted to have Reverend Gerald Durley. He is a retired professor emeritus of Providence Ministry Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. I think I understand he's a little busy right now with a little election they're having in Georgia, so I'm particularly glad that you were able to spend some time with us. Reverend Durley connects the disciplines of faith and science with the lessons learned from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I'm also pleased to introduce William Edelglass, who is the director of studies at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. He teaches and writes in the areas of Buddhist theory and environmental humanities. And last, but certainly not least, is our moderator tonight, Reverend Canon Sally Bingham. Sally is the founder and president emeritus of the Interfaith Power and Light, which mobilizes people of faith to take on climate change. She's also a personal friend of mine and a member of our National Advisory Board at UCS, where she served for the last 15 years. So Sally, I'm gonna hand it off to you, and all of our listeners sit back and enjoy what I'm sure is gonna be a very interesting and productive conversation. You're muted, Sally.
So I am. Thank you, Ken, for both letting me know I was muted and for the introduction. And welcome to all of you on the panel, and welcome to all of you listeners. It's exciting for me to have the opportunity to talk about this connection between science and religion. It started for me years ago when Carl Sagan was still alive, and he invited scientists, and then John Kerry, Tim Wirth, and a couple of other senators invited a lot of religious leaders to Washington for a conference. And this was probably 25 years ago. And Carl Sagan happened to say something that has stuck with me forever. He got in front of everybody and talked about when he looked through the Hubble telescope, he thought he was looking into the face of God. And it just spurred in me the fact that scientists are not adverse to religion or faith. And I think that what religion can give to science is guidelines on justice, faith, peace, and truth, because all religions teach those things. And I think that the religious community can be very helpful when science is making their experiments. I mean, you think about the atomic bomb, and now the conversation when we're dealing with climate change about geoengineering. And I think that working together, science and religion, can really help one another. And I think that this evening and this conversation will hopefully send some bright lights on the different faiths and how our faiths inform justice and climate change and truth. For me, and I'm going to start with this because I'm going to ask each of you how you made the connection to your faith and these issues. But for me, it started as a child. I grew up in an Episcopal church. And when I was an adult and came to San Francisco from New York, sitting in a pew and professing a love for God and listening to the 10 Commandments, and the first and great is to love God, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And I was connected to in a big environmental organization at that time, and I was learning about what humans were doing to the planet. And we were destroying everything. We were affecting people's air, people's water. And I thought, how can I sit in a pew and say, I love God, I love creation, I love my neighbor, and then continue to pollute my neighbor's air? And that is the seed that started my hoping to let every person of faith, particularly we obviously started out in the Christian church, we started out Episcopal Power and Light, but I decided that everybody who sits in a pew or goes to a congregation or a temple and professes the love for a creation or a mystery in life that supports us, we have to take care of that, or nobody's going to look after us. And so over a period of 10 years, I went to college, and then I went to seminary, and then I became a priest, and then we started Interfaith Power and Light. And now with our 22,000 congregations around the country and all different religions involved, it has become a a movement in a way. And Dr. Durley, who you're going to hear from later, is the chair of the Interfaith Power and Light National Board. But I'd like to know from each of you, and certainly from the Buddhist and the Jewish tradition, Islam, how you all came to realize that climate was a moral issue that religions need to address. And I'm going to start with Gerald. Can you tell us what led you to make the connection between your role as a minister in a Baptist church and then becoming an advocate for climate?
Thank you very much, Sally. And I want to thank Ken Kimmell, the Union of Concerned Scientists, for tonight. This is a very unique experience. I'm honored to be with this distinguished panel. I've had an opportunity to meet them and listen to them. And I'm probably the most unlikely person on this panel tonight, because 10 years ago, I could have cared less about climate change. I didn't care whether a polar bear got to the next ice glacier or not. I was not concerned about carbon dioxide in the air. It did not bother me about the asthmatic conditions that were occurring to those that I was called to serve, because my life was always around civil and human rights. I started with Dr. King in 1959, Martin and John Lewis and all of us. And we knew then that constitutionally that it was right for people to vote, the right for people to ride in the front of the bus, to buy where they could afford to buy. And so I was steeped in the civil and human rights of our time. We knew that it was constitutionally proper for us to receive these certain advantages. And so all the way through, I spent all of my earlier life in the civil and human rights era. But I finished school, I went on and I became a psychologist, and I began to understand much about institutional racism and what did it do, but I did not see it as related to the environment, nor to science. I saw it as just racism because of certain attitudes toward people, because of color, because of class, because of gender, whatever it might be, the discriminatory patterns. But about 10 years ago, about 25 years ago, I began to understand that it's one thing to understand the psychological part of a being. It's another thing to understand the spiritual part. So I went to Howard University and received a master's degree in divinity. But again, I was just talking about the overall, how God worked in our lives towards salvation, not connecting it with the environment. That was alien to my thinking. That was alien to what I was brought up to believe. But one day a lady came to Atlanta and she began to talk to me about the environment and what it meant and how it negatively, disproportionately impacted communities of color. And I wondered, why would she be talking to me about that? I've got other things on my mind. But she said, you need to talk and listen and tell other people about it. Her name was Jane Fonda. Jane and I began to talk. She introduced me to her husband, Ted Turner. I said, I don't have time for this. I'm dealing with rent control. I'm dealing with police brutality. I'm dealing with issues that directly impact those that I'm called to serve. Then Jane said, but I want you to meet a lady named Sally Bingham. I said, I don't have time to meet an Episcopal priest from San Francisco. I've got other things on my mind. It's not a priority. I don't think that I was so unique, because climate change and the mitigation of climate change is not a priority in many people's lives when you're talking about a survival of day-to-day living. But I began to study and I began to understand what carbon dioxide meant, and I began to understand the health conditions. And then I began to combine that with what the teachings in the Christian tradition said. This is my commandment. I give you a perfectly balanced ecological world with all the air that you need and water, and the bees and the plants can work together. But I want you to take care of it. That did not register with me, because I was talking about committing adultery. I was talking about fornication. I was talking about all the things in the second book of the Bible, but I missed the first commandment. But now I put the first commandment together. Take care of my earth and I will give you everything that I need. And I began to pull those. So pull those things together. And that's my orientation now. After 10 years, understanding that we received a perfectly balanced ecological world where it all came together. And even now, politically, we're saying words like save the soul of America. The soul is something that keeps something together and gives it life. I believe that the soul of America is in the environment. So I don't make a distinction between what the scientists say, what the conservationists say, the political leaders and the business leaders, and the scientific and faith community. It all must come together because the soul of America rests in the environment. And those of us in the faith community, we're charged, we're commanded to keep the environment clean and keep it balanced, because that's what God gave us. So I see that, and I see that saving of the soul is across all faiths, Jewish, Muslim, all of them. So when we come together and join our connected dots with the scientific community, the business community, and the political community, then we have a chance to really save the soul of America. But we've got to come out of those silos. And I guess that's what my mission is now, after having pastored for 25 years, deans of university. This is the most challenging effort that we face. So I'm just so thankful to be with my other colleagues tonight. And I'm excited about this. When I hear people talk about the environment and they're dull, I wonder, do they know what they're talking about? You've got to get excited with all that we've learned, all that we're learning, and all that we can articulate. As we said in the movement, we want to organize, strategize, and then we're going to mobilize, and we're going to mitigate climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. We both come at this from our Christian backgrounds, and I'm wondering if Rabbi Aron would tell us how she made the connection with her Jewish faith to get involved in, I know your synagogue was one of the first to put solar on the roof way back 20 years ago, but maybe you could share with us how your Jewish faith led you to get involved in these issues of justice and environmental justice.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a very concrete answer to this question. When I was a child growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, every Saturday morning we would drive from our home in North Avondale up to Roselawn, where the synagogue was. And on our way, we passed Procter & Gamble's factories and those other industries, and they were spewing pollution into our air and into the Milk Creek. So then when I studied laws in the Talmud about tanneries and about keeping air clean in our towns, and when I sat in Sabbath services and heard the reading from the book of Genesis, calling upon us to be protectors, shomrim of the earth, there was this very clear connection for me between what I saw and what needed to be done. There was no question in my mind that humans impacted the environment. Later on, I served a student pulpit in Pittsburgh, and I was able to see that humans can also impact the environment in positive ways when we commit to cleaning up the damage that we've done. So let me speak more generally for a moment. Sometimes people tease about Reform Judaism, the movement I represent, that we're just one step away from the Unitarians, with the joke being that Unitarians believe that there is at most one God. But an important contemporary mystic and theologian, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, turns that joke around into an interesting teaching. He argues that the core teaching of Judaism is the message that you are not God. He worries that we often act as if we were God, as if everything should center around us, as if we were the measure of all things. We act as if whatever benefits us is good, no matter its greater impact, and that nothing is as important as our own desires or comforts and pleasures. So if we can learn from our religious traditions that we are not God, and we can be a little more humble, if we are less arrogant, then we can treat others and the earth in a more caring way. Jewish tradition teaches that we are but tenant farmers, tilling the soil that does not ultimately belong to us. We teach this by saying the earth belongs to God, and we do not have the right to do with it whatever we want. We are merely holding it in trust for future generations. There's one other idea, and that is the sense of the chain of generations. This is very strong in Judaism. You might have seen it if you ever went to a bar or bat mitzvah. They pass the Torah, the handwritten parchment scroll, from grandparents to parents to children. And we imagine behind the grandparents, hundreds of generations that take us from the ancient past to today. And we imagine that extending that chain forward into the future is our responsibility. So that idea that we have to sacrifice now for future generations is part of Jewish culture. In our families, it was what our grandparents did for our parents, what their parents, who were often immigrants, did in helping them get started, what our parents did for us. And they didn't make this sacrifice with the expectation that that sacrifice would be reciprocated, that we would do for them. Rather, it was with the hope and expectation that we would make similar sacrifices for the next generation and for the generations that come after them. So this is how I feel connected to the issue of environmental justice.
Yeah, and it's so important. And now, how about with Islam? Ibrahim, how did you make the connection to this work coming out of the Islamic faith?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. This is such an amazing group of people that I love the history and I love the storytelling. So I just want to honor all that and all that hard work that you guys have put in. And everything that you have said is echoing, obviously, the Islamic context and perspective on this. I think the place that I want to start is just to give a context around Islam and science in general. I think, we think of like the role of human beings in the natural world, or sort of our understanding of where we get guidance from. In this plane of existence, we have revelation, and that was communicated through prophets and angels. We have human intelligence, which is guided by revelation, and we have instinct. So now if our instinct and our intelligence are not guided by revelation in the Islamic context, then what we're dealing with is lost in opinion and theory and error. So that sort of the observation, using these senses, understanding patterns and running experiments and learning and making predictions and seeking trends, all of this is crucial to understanding reading the weather, reading weather patterns and climate change and understanding that. And then the Quran, it actually says that human beings can have a negative impact. It says corruption has appeared on the land and the earth because of what the hands of humans have wrought. And many scholars believe that this is a part of the Quran that basically says that we can have an impact on the planet. For me, this started way, way, way long ago. I grew up, if you can imagine, just looking out, and I lived in Brooklyn in the early 80s. So I have the benefit, everybody grew up in crazy times. Everybody did. Everybody here has some crazy stories. I grew up in the middle of the crack epidemic and the craziness of that era, when you would hear gunshots regularly, right? Every night. And that was the norm, even if you were a person who was safe or disconnected from that. It was a very different world. So I remember looking out from my window and seeing just a sea of buildings. And it was a time in my life that I remember thinking that was the whole world. That was the whole entire universe of everything. And then fast forward, my dad would take us upstate regularly. And if you understand me and my relationship to the planet and the earth, my dad has always been someone who's gone outdoors and been outdoors regularly. So he's always brought us out there. We do crazy winter hiking trips as a family. When it's the coldest and when it's the hardest to go out there, we like to go out there. And I encourage everyone who's on here to get outside even when it's cold, because the cold is a blessing from God too. That we have, he brought us to a place in Bear Mountain, and I write about this in Green Dean, where he started praying just on the ground. And I was like, well, normally we pray in the masjid, and you have to understand that my father converted to Islam. So he grew up Episcopalian. So that his understanding of it was very personal. And he said, he related a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that says, anywhere you may be at the time of prostration is a place of prayer. Everywhere on earth is a place of prayer. Now, obviously, some places can be polluted and corrupted, but I remember that stuck in my head. Fast forward to many years later, I'm working with Van Jones and others on the Green Jobs campaign. And in these spaces where we're trying to convince people to get on board, to support these ideas. But most of the conversations I was having were hyper secular. There wasn't any nuance to the conversation so we could translate to other people. And so I kept finding Muslims that were in the work and doing the work, in the work of water and waste and energy and food. All of these areas, Muslims were taking the ideas that they, in their heart in Islam, 6 principles that I write about in Green Dean, and they were taking those things and they were using those principles to do the work inspired from an Islamic context. So I wrote about all those folks. And I think the process of really gathering those stories and putting that out there has put me in a position where I understand that, but I also do environmental work. So I think when I'm coming to the table conversation here is, I've always been curious not only about the spiritual aspect of it, but how do we solve problems related to the natural world? And as human beings, we have persistent human problems. How do we get clean water? Every human being from the beginning of time to today has to get clean water, has to figure out what to do with their waste, has to understand, needs some energy for something, needs to go from point A to point B. So really the question that I like to offer to people is, this is what drives me. It's understanding how can we make these decisions and solve these problems better than we've ever done before as human beings. And thankfully, as a Muslim, I feel like we have a really strong foundation to approaching that question.
Well, thank you very much for giving us that introduction, not only to you, but to Islam as well. And now with the Buddhist tradition, which I just know from my own friends who are Buddhists that everything is connected to everything else. But William, maybe you'll tell us, how did you get involved in climate ethics through, or if you did, through a Buddhist perspective?
Thanks, Sally. And let me just start by saying that it's humbling to be here with Gerald and Melanie and Ibrahim and Sally. And I'm a big fan of Interfaith Power and Light and the Union of Concerned Scientists, these 2 wonderful organizations and institutions. So I was actually an environmentalist before I became a Buddhist, starting as a teenager. And I worked as a wilderness guide, and then I did a PhD and became an environmental philosopher. So Buddhism for me really came second, and I brought my environmentalist sensibilities to Buddhism. So I'm part of what some people might call eco-Buddhism or green Buddhism, and I found that the Buddhist side of eco-Buddhism is really helpful for me in several ways as an environmentalist or thinking about climate. And one is that some Buddhist practices can help us cultivate the capacity to look really deeply at what's really hard and challenging or painful. And for me personally, I'm the father of 2 6-year-old twins, a lover of the wild world and the many companion species around us. And it is profoundly painful for me to acknowledge what's really going on and what the foreseeable future will bring as a father, as somebody who cares about the institutions and people of our world and other animals. And the Buddhist teacher and environmental activist Joanna Macy is fond of saying that the greatest challenge today is simply to stay present with what's actually going on in our world, to sustain our gaze. Because when we sustain our gaze, yes, we see much that is really profoundly beautiful, but we also see so much pain and injustice, some of which we're complicit in just by living the lives that we live. So at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, where I work, we offered a course earlier this year called Mindfully Facing Climate Change. We had several thousand people participating from over 50 countries. And a lot of what that was about was just simply developing the capacities to face the situation we're in without distracting ourselves, without looking away. And another way in which Buddhism impacts how I think of my work around climate is that there's an ideal of what's called the bodhisattva, someone who's committed to cultivating oneself to become the kind of person who's capable of alleviating the sufferings of others, and ultimately really someone who's devoted to a kind of impossible task, an impossible vow, which is to alleviate the sufferings of all sentient beings. And for me, I find this helpful because it reminds me that even as so much is out of my control in what happens with the climate, what happens with my children also, but what happens with the climate and other challenges we face as a society. And even as I look back and think about pipeline and other protests that I've gone to that have appeared to be unsuccessful, or other projects I've worked on, But the practice of environmental virtues, of becoming more mindful of my actions, of cultivating humility and equanimity, even as we do pursue a more just and sustainable world with friends and collaborators. There's an ideal of human flourishing that is both Buddhist for me and necessary for a life-sustaining society, but it is meaningful just through doing the practice, even if the outcome isn't what I want it to be. So I guess I would say that as far as how it informs my work on climate ethics, I don't think Buddhism necessarily provides specific rules or political or economic principles that would help us adjudicate between, say, competing proposals for the distribution of costs and benefits of mitigation or adaptation or other harms from climate change, but helps make a meaningful life that's devoted to working on the personal, the social, the political levels. And it gives a framework for practice for me that's inclusive. And I think that's what Buddhism brings for me.
Right. And those are very important principles. We all know all of us who have worked on climate, and probably lots of people who aren't working on it, but who are aware that the climate is changing and why and how it's happening. One of the things that climate change has done, I think, for society, and particularly recently, is shown how it affects different communities more seriously and in different ways. And that, well, from the Christian perspective, Jesus said, "What you do to the least of us, you do to me." And when we look around and realize that a lot of the poor communities, not only around the world, but here in the United States, live closer to areas that are polluted. And then in the developing world, where they haven't got the resources to put up solar or mitigate some of what's happening to them, they can't build dikes when the sea is rising. And so much of the climate change issue shines a light on the injustices and the racial injustice. And those things are intricately connected. And I'm wondering, Ibrahim, is there something in the Islamic religion that helps other Muslims make this connection between environmental injustice and racial injustice as it relates to climate change? I know could you do that in 3 minutes, please?
I think I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to push back gently even on the frame of racial justice and the notion of racial justice, only because I think the primary problem isn't like racial issues. We have a white supremacy problem, and we have people who believe in the supremacy of white people, which can be white people, Black people, brown people, all different colored folks. And the reason why I point that out is that white supremacy exists on a spectrum. And that spectrum is, on one end, the way that a lot of religious people like to talk about idols, or the time before the faith came, where that's just the way it is. Or I can't change this, or it's unmovable. And what am I going to do about it? Or I benefited from it, so how am I going to, I can't change it. The other end of the spectrum is people that are willing to kill people for it. So as someone who, in my own home, physically, if I call the police, if I call the police because there's an intruder in my own home, I cannot do that because I know that the police will probably, most likely, kill me when they come. Most likely. So the actual reality of, so when we talk about racial injustice, and a lot of times we're dancing around the actual real issue. We've had an incredible, this is almost like the last country in the world of antiquity. This is a country that built itself up on slavery, on chattel slavery. And we wonder that the decisions to do that, and then all the eventual ripples of it, that would cause some poisoning of the land and the air and the sea. So that sort of, to me, it's all 110% connected, right? That we have made these decisions and rooted this experiment in this horrible, horrible way of living. And now we have to unravel it, but a large amount of our population does not want to recognize this truth. And that includes people of color. I'm not absolving anyone of not believing in this thing, because we're all in this together. So to me, the whole conversation around all of these systems that seem very heavy and weighted on top of us, one of the root things is the relationship between overconsumption and waste, right? Using more and creating pollution because of what you're putting into the atmosphere. And what happens to our soul because of this overconsumption, this idea that we don't have enough. So I think the fundamental question here is around the ideas of not only just that white supremacy, which helps keep up this idea of scarcity, that we don't have enough. And Brother Gerald pointed that out, that if we don't exist within a sense of scarcity, we actually exist within a framework that there is enough, that there's plenty for all of us, and that we have to work together. That is fundamentally the management of all of these systems, the management of people, the decision-making that goes into that. That to me is the crux of the conversation. And because in this place that we live right now, it was built on white supremacy, we have to dismantle that, and we can't dance around it. So that's why I don't say that I push back very aggressively, but I'm just thinking the frame of racial justice, even the conversation we're having in the country around equality, those are all dancing around it. We have to confront that demon within us that's telling us that some people are better than others, and move past that aggressively.
Well, that leads me right into asking you, Dr. Durley. Gerald, you were involved with the civil rights movement and involved with environmental injustices and injustices in general for a number of years. And I wonder if you could kind of give us a sense of how did that work in the civil rights movement transfer over now to where you have become a real advocate for stopping the climate from changing so drastically. And I'd love to hear how you came from the civil rights movement to becoming such an avid climate advocate.
You know, as I was sitting here, there are certain times in our lives, I heard William say that he had two 6-year-old twins. He's a father, and we have fathers who are proud and mothers who are proud of when they see someone who is doing something that gives them a certain sense of pride because they go right to the issue. And right now, Ibrahim, as you were speaking, we have a saying, has the torch been passed on to the next generation? And I felt a certain sense of pride when I heard him talk and going back to a privileged mentality of a supremacist attitude. And I think when we come to, and this is why in the civil rights movement, we had to connect all of the dots. We understood that faith was at the heart of it. We understood that we had to have a moral and an ethical gyroscope when we faced the kinds of systems that denied us the constitutional right. Because those that built those systems had something that I think is still permeated in today's society. And that word is fear. The fear of losing power, the fear of losing what we have, and fear is predicated upon ignorance. And so when it comes to that kind of fear, when it comes over into the climate area, there's a lot of ignorance around this, and there's a lot of fear around this. So there are a lot of barriers that are built up. But again, when it comes into even our communities, when it comes to buying cheap land and putting toxic waste dumps in the area, and Cancer Island down there in Louisiana, 85-mile stretch down there, and the hog waste in North Carolina, and what's going on in Flint, Michigan, and I could go on and on. These are predicated around areas where people of color and poor are there. This is an attitude of putting profits over people, and it's justified by what he was talking about, the fear and that attitude that it's a privileged kind of attitude. So if it's to come together, we've got to understand that first we've got to look at what we call the original sin of the nation. And the original sin was predicated upon, I am better than you because of my color. Then we move from my color to my gender, then to my faith and all these. So we've got to break down all of those barriers to get to the real crux of the issue. And that is, how do we, in the Christian tradition, as Dr. King used to say, how do we, if I'm suffering, we're all suffering. None of us are free until we're all free. And therefore, if we're talking about a democratic process, then we've got to put into play where all of us can work together to have the right to free, toxic-free air, to have that, to clean water. It's a sad state of affairs when waste energy companies can come in and buy out entire areas and wipe out communities. That's a moral and an ethical issue that we've got to stand up for across all faiths. And I guess that's where the dots come together, that now we're beginning to realize it. And I feel more optimistic now than I did in 1960, because I see young people across color lines and across racial lines and across even economic lines and faith lines coming together to say, wait, if we destroy the real soul of America, the environment, then none of us will exist. All of us will die. So consequently, in our tradition, we believe that all of us work together. We're all in this to, we use the term salvation, but I think it's much larger than that. It's how do you save a nation? By saving an environment, by saving a people, by reaching out to our brothers and sisters on both sides. So in the civil rights movement, if you notice, our base was faith. Every one of the movement, Martin, Hosea, Jesse, John, all C.T. Vivian, all of us, myself, we all had a faith base, so that when we reach the point of finiteness, scientists, they do the research, they get all the facts together. We appreciate the facts, but every now and then they reach a point we just don't know. We've reached a point we cannot find the antibiotic to this virus, and we'll keep experimenting. And we all reach a finite point, so at that point, we've got to go into infinite wisdom, and that's where God comes in, Allah comes in, Jehovah Jireh, whoever we call it, and we go into that position. And I think we're at that point right now with the climate. We've got all of the kinds of sociological conditions that are going on, but we're reaching the point, what do we do? Do we transform police? Do we defund police? Do we take this out? Do we change that? And we've got to go back to what's really real, and that is that source of a spiritual connection to a deity that's greater than any of us. And therein lies the real strength when science and faith begins to come together. We've never, I thank God that the scientists took us off of the iron lung and came up with polio vaccines and came up with cancer drugs and these kinds of things. But some kind of way we began to say, if we can make more money, we can shy away from certain things. I think the faith community has the ability to hold not only science, but business and politicians accountable based upon who we can come back to understand that we must discern a cultural and a spiritual awareness for the good of all of the people. And I think that I believe that the civil rights movement was a precursor to the environmental movement, for the Clean Act, for the Clean Water Act, for the Endangered Species Act, because we included all of those elements, but we knew that we had to stay firm to an overall riding principle that there is a God that controls the earth and the universe. And we say in the Christian tradition, God owns the entire earth. He controls it all. So we got to go back to that basic. And then I think we can find the kind of freedom to eradicate the ignorance, to get rid of the fear, to displace hate between all of us. And I think that that's what this call is about, where we can get rid of the fear and the ignorance and come together as one unified body, understanding our foundation is on faith, but we need these other tentacles, science and education, politics and business.
Gerald, I think you're 100% right on that. We do need to unite. And I'm interested in how the Buddhist tradition comes to, or how do you deal, William, with climate change? How does that fit into Buddhism? Because where Gerald talks about a God, and Melanie will too, that controls the universe, but I don't believe, of course you're the expert, but I don't believe that Buddhists believe in a God. And I'd love to know how this connects to climate change, how Buddhism connects to climate change.
So there were a bunch of non-Buddhist Indian philosophers who accused Buddhists of believing in a God. They just didn't call it a God. But did you want me to say something about climate justice also, Sally? Or
yes, please. Yes.
Maybe I'll make a couple points. One is that with regards to what Buddhism might be able to offer to, say, issues of racial justice and climate justice. I think one of the reasons that the social practice of race is so pernicious is that it operates at a level that conditions our thoughts and feelings and perceptions, so that our racialized thoughts and feelings and perceptions are, this is kind of what Ibrahim was saying, they're just a natural given. They're the way things are. That's how they appear. And even if most of us might think now that racialized thinking and feeling and white supremacist perceptions of the world, it's not a naturally given, it's socially constructed and it's always changing, but just believing that. So me knowing that I may have all kinds of unconscious biases that impact how I perceive the world doesn't really mean that I won't perceive the world in a deeply problematic and racialized way. And in my work, at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, we actually do offer courses that integrate Buddhist practice through meditation, trying to slow down and pay attention to the way in which our perceptions and feelings and thoughts are caught up in the racialized world that we're in, that Ibrahim spoke so eloquently about. So again, I think what Buddhism might have to offer here is a sense of practice, that one can integrate in a broad, expansive sense of practice how to engage with racial issues, which seems deeply appropriate today. But more directly with climate justice, Sally, you were saying earlier that one of the things your Buddhist friends have said is that everything is interdependent. And, there's a way in which the racially concentrated differences in environmental harms and healthcare and wealth and so many other ways in which we think about our lives and the quality of our lives that we've inherited from this profoundly violent racial history that we have, that in many ways goes hand in hand with climate. If we had in the 1980s, when there was enough knowledge already to make a pretty significant transition, and would have required only 2% of GDP to make that transition to a sustainable climate. There were political forces that prevented that from happening at the highest levels. And in my mind, the challenges we face kind of behind climate change, what leads to climate change, are similar to challenges to what we face with overcoming a white supremacist culture and the economy and politics and education, the distribution of resources and of all sorts that goes along with that. It's like one issue behind both of those. And I think that what Buddhism does offer is a way of thinking about how everything is mutually interdependent, that there are conditions that lead some things to arise and not others, and that we can think deeply about what those conditions are. And, as an environmental philosopher, environmentalists and environmental philosophers like in the 70s and 80s used to think all we need to do is change everybody's mind so that they believe that plants and animals and ecosystems are morally valuable, that there's an intrinsic value, that they become non-anthropocentrists, and then we'll be okay. We'll all we'll have a sustainable society. But it turns out people don't want to change their minds, and what's much more effective is having, and Sally, you alluded to this about bringing more people in, that finding common ground and shared common values. Everybody wants a livable, sustainable, life-sustaining society. All the religious traditions value that. And I think what Buddhism might have to offer is a way of framing practice that can be inclusive and be focused on a practice and on values that we can share in common without getting too worked up about certain sorts of beliefs and debates at a higher level. So, the fact that the climate movement is now a climate justice movement is the best thing that happened to the climate movement, because it became so much bigger and so much more inclusive.
Well, thank you. And leading to the Jewish tradition, and Melanie, how have you integrated your congregation into understanding environmental racism and environmental injustice? Because I know that you've done some of that, and I'd love to hear how the tradition speaks to those issues.
So everyone has said such important things, and I hope I can just bring them forward a little bit. I'm involved in community organizing, so people come to meetings and they have desires about what's keeping them up at night and what they want us to work on. And so sometimes people feel that we have to make a choice between working on racial justice or working on combating climate change. And over time, I think people can come to the realization that really working on global climate change is a work on racial justice, and securing the rights of racial minorities will necessitate addressing climate change. I learned this first as a child when my neighborhood became racially integrated and the city decided they would only pick up garbage once a week as opposed to twice a week in the more affluent neighborhoods. And we had to form a neighborhood organization and fight that every inch of the way so that racial minorities, less affluent communities have borne the brunt of pollution and the impact of global climate change. I think there's also something that religion can contribute in helping humanity to get beyond the systemic racism and the xenophobia that are so present in our world today and are so important for us if we're going to work for racial justice. Evolutionary biologists tell us that the cultural meaning of religion was that it enabled us to bond with a larger group beyond the 15 people who were our immediate contacts or the 50 people who lived in our village, and that this was really vital in all the aspects of civilization. But that wasn't easy. And how do we know that? We know it from the Bible. In the 5 books of Moses, there is a commandment to love the stranger, not to abuse the stranger, to remember that you were a stranger. That is repeated 39 times, more than any other single commandment. Now, why is it repeated so often? Because it doesn't stick with people, because it's not the norm, that it's something that we have to teach people to care about someone you don't know, to care about someone who's different than you, to go beyond your immediate social circle. And it's something that we have to educate people and socialize people to. In the same way, really caring about the future, making sacrifices for the sake of the future also isn't natural. Economists, for example, can quantify the degree to which we discount the future. They do these experiments where they ask people, would you rather have $50 today or $75 or $100 in the future? And even if it's next week, people want what's now. So it's critical that religion play this role in helping us expand our circles of caring and teaching us that we have to invest in the future. So this is something that I hope we can learn from Judaism and from all our religious faiths and transmit to the community in general.
Well, thank you. And that, I think that leads right into what is going to be pretty much an open question right now. And whoever feels like responding, put your hand up and we'll unmute you, or you unmute yourself. But there's a myth that religion and science can't get along, or that somehow we have, we're at odds with one another. And I've never believed that. And when we started this evening, and I said, Carl Sagan looked into a telescope and saw the eyes of God. I know that religion and science can work together. And I've always had this sort of catchy phrase, which is religion wouldn't have a prayer without science. And from my own experience, when I first started talking about climate change from the pulpit, and then we have coffee hour, and then I would be challenged on the numbers I might have used, or talking about parts per million. And that's when I realized that I had to have some scientific information, or I shouldn't be talking about climate change. It's not a subject you can just address in general, because so many people don't think that climate change is really happening. So what I'm asking you, and I don't think anybody's probably prepared any kind of an answer for this, but it's how can we help the scientific and religious community become a bigger coalition and inform one another? Ibrahim, you're going to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. I think about it all the time. I think in Islam, there's really no dichotomy between religion and science. There's no, the notion, and this is one of the fundamental things I think that's important to note, that you can go if your intellect and your scientific inquiry is not guided by something solid, like in this context, we're talking about a logical tradition of a religion, a belief in God. In my context, in the Muslim context, you believe in the oneness of God and oneness of creation, meaning that everything else in creation is created. And as you, as part of that creation, is understanding more about the patterns and the code that God has put into everything in creation and studying and learning more. And in Islamic context, you're not seeking the origins of existence. You're seeking to understand more about existence. So we're not on this quest for this sort of like this origin point or that anchor there. And I think when you don't have, and a lot of times science is unanchored by that. And because it's unanchored, it gives it the ability to sway to anything that might come its way. So in this instance, you get incredible innovations in war, in killing people, in destruction, in despair. We've created more guns and more bombs and more nuclear weapons and more walls. We've been so incredibly smart with that. But which is interesting now in this moment, that every bomb and every gun and every wall we've ever built is useless to COVID-19. Everyone from the beginning of time to today has no value with this existential crisis that we're facing. The other path that you take when you're ungrounded, when you don't have that anchor, is that you fall into that despair of that there's not enough, that we need to control it because you see yourself as apart from the natural world. So in Islamic context, if you're apart from it, then you see it as something not you, and that detachment from the natural world means that you assume that your actions are negative on the planet. You assume that you're a virus, like in the Matrix, if some of you guys remember in the Matrix when he talked about that wonderful part of it. But you assume that you can destroy it. But actually, it's more like what the rabbi was saying, is that we are the gardeners, we are the tenders. We have to maintain and support, and that's our role. Our role is to understand the natural world with such detail that we can maintain this deep trust, like the brother Gerald was sharing. We can maintain this deep trust. I think that if I was a deeper immersed, my dad told me and my siblings to become scientists, or he said, become an environmental engineer. And he said this in the 80s. We had no idea why he said that and why he meant that, because he wasn't an environmental engineer. And my sister, who's now an environmental engineer, she said that the world needs more engineers rather than just scientists, because we need people that will take that scientific method and implement it, that there's a process in place. So I think you need people that are ready to do that implementation, like Brother William said, in using that anchor that you have, that moral anchor. So then you create new things that are regenerative, that heal the earth, that heal people, instead of creating technologies that extract from people. And actually, there was a statement that I think someone from Interfaith Power and Light once said. They said, and I actually wrote about it in Green Dean, they said, energy from heaven versus energy from hell. And they were talking about energy from the ground, right, that we burn and we combust, all the extractive technologies. There is so much more innovation and discovery and imagination that can be put into things that heal scarred lands, that make deserts bloom again, that make that capture, carbon and organize and use the natural world to do that. There's so much more things to discover in terms of haptic technologies that we can use that will help us get around better and help people who have different types of abilities to be able to live more fuller lives. That's the beauty of being a scientist guided by faith, is that you can create astonishing things that help people live better lives.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Melanie, do you have some ideas on how we can work together? You're muted.
how we can build a broader coalition and really benefit. And I think we often think about how the environmental movement can benefit by having religionists, but religionists can benefit by working with the environmental movement. Because we have to remember that for young people, their whole life experience has been at a time when religion has been perceived as a problem, when it's been associated with fanaticism and intolerance, right? Those are my kids. Whereas I came of age, those of us who are a little older, when we associated religion with social justice, right? With Dr. Martin Luther King, with Father Berrigan and the struggle against the Vietnam War. This is how I caught one day on the radio on NPR on Intelligence Squared, a debate resolved. The world would be better off without religion. So I think by religion adopting concern about the environment and about environmental issues and racial justice, we have an ability to reach out to that younger generation. And I've seen over the last 4 years, religious groups like Nuns on the Bus on the Catholic side and Bend the Arc on the Jewish side step forward and remind us that hunger and poverty and justice and healthcare and the care of the earth are religious issues. So there is a place for us to work together, and that can be a very powerful coalition.
Right, thank you. I've always felt that climate change was a very important moral issue. I mean, how we respond is a demonstration of how we care about other people and what kind of neighbors are we.
And I think when we talk about the environment, Sally, what Ibrahim was saying, he talked about an anchorless. When there's a feeling of being anchored, not being anchored, and not having a source of stability, people tend to go in many different directions. Right now, we're facing a sense of hopelessness because of the pandemic, because of police brutality, because of the climate. There's a certain sense of hopelessness. And what faith tends to do is give people a certain sense of hope that it will be all right. And I think and when we base our evidence on the sciences that come up there, when we come together, we combine those things, it gives a certain sense of hope to get away from that depressed feeling. I deal every day with people who are just depressed and they've given up on life in general. In our tradition, we always talked about the body, the mind, and the spirit. And when we talk about the body, we have to look at what the scientists have said about what the body does and what we put into the body and how it grows, and how the scientific people that are psychologists talk about the mind. And of course, those of us in the spirit. So when the pneuma, the psychic come together, then we've got a full person. And then living in an environment that encourages that kind of growth. I think what's going to be necessary as we move in this next part between all of these moving parts is the key word. And we try to teach it, that's communication. Our communication has broken down. Now, what is communication? It's founded on 3 primary principles. If I'm to communicate with you between science and religion or different faiths, first, I've got to understand you. So the faith community and the science community, we've got to understand each other, that we work in union together. So we've got to understand each other. Then we've got to respect our differences. When we respect our differences, we can grow. And then finally, we've got to trust what we come up with. So many times we distrust what scientists or what faith leaders might say. But when we can understand, respect, and trust, then we communicate. Then I think we can get back to what we were talking about, trying to find some stability to be able to be free and open enough to move toward the mitigation of climate change. Because right now there's so much ignorance and we don't know. But when we can begin to trust the scientists, trust the faith leaders, trust others that are working on this, I think we've got a shot at trying to make a difference in our country and in the world.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Anybody else want to make a comment on just this linkage between science and religion? William.
Yeah, I'm really sympathetic with what everybody has said. I also just want to point out that I feel like in our lives as modern people, we might think about religion and science as very different, but we embody, what's Walt Whitman's line? We embody multitudes, and we can, many people embody these 2 different, what we might think of as different approaches, but think of them more in a unified way. And as a religious person motivated to be just and ethical, as obviously non-religious people are also, we need the sciences, including the social sciences, economics. If we want to think about incarceration, or we want to think about just economic distribution, we need economics, we need sociology, we need psychology to help us understand, what are the kinds of policies that actually are more just. That is, some ways of thinking about the world, if we're mistaken, like if I think, Florida is south of Honolulu, there's no moral consequences to that. But there are many views that I think about the world that have significant moral consequences that could lead to some people suffering, and we need the social sciences to help us. I would also want to say that I think even when we think there's a great divide, it may be less than we think. My favorite example is Matthew Scully, one of Bush's speechwriters, one of the people who coined the phrase the axis of evil, somebody who one might not think of as a comrade, but he wrote this book called Dominion. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 months.
Right.
He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, a conservative Christian, and he uses that as a frame, the dominion, the biblical notion of dominion, as an argument for why the treatment of animals in the kind of agriculture that we have today is a kind of blasphemous act. It's a moral crime. And what religion does do, in my mind, the hard scientists have told us pretty much everything we need to know to get as activated as possible on climate change. We need the social sciences to help us do that effectively, but religion provides a moral framework to motivate us and to help us act. Stories that make sense of living in an age of climate destabilization and living in a way that contributes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Melanie, Ibrahim, Gerald, anything else on this linkage between the two institutions of science and religion?
I want to thank science for coming up years ago. When you went to the movies, excuse me, when you went to the movies, it was always so chic to sit and smoke a cigarette after you did something. All your cowboy movies had people smoking. You got into a love scene, and after the love scene, you smoked. And it was a glorious kind of cultural thing. And the scientists began to connect smoking with cancer. But until it became a real lung issue, then it did not quite make it. And we began to make the transition between what the scientists were saying and what it was doing to the body. And I think that that's very critical, because science, even now with climate change and what it's doing, is giving us gut level issues. In our society, people do not begin to move and come together until they see the direct relationship to their own life and their own survival. Scientists are giving us that basis now. Now we've got to take that, extrapolate it, and exegete it in such a way that it can become real in the lives of people that are around us. And that's what I think is so critical when we begin to bring the two together, that we see what the scientists are doing, and then how do we take it in and massage it, if you will, enough to allow to share it with those that we're called to work with and to serve and work in our communities. Then we can make the difference. Otherwise, it's still disconnected.
I'll just add really quickly that there's also the deep tradition within our, that a lot of our understanding of how to practice our faith is actually rooted in the scientific method of inquiry and learning about sort of, you get into these rhythms and patterns and saying certain things and certain prayers at certain times. And they've discovered over time, and many religious people and scholars and people who have had traditions of deep practice have gotten into these rhythms, and they've had certain realizations. And that's a system that we've only discovered, and you have teachers related to that. I think that part of the religious experience I would offer and say to folks who might be in the scientific community and who are deep into the data, into the information, you can also apply that rigor to your tradition. And if you don't, like you can rediscover your tradition, applying some rigor that you might have used in the scientific context in your own personal discovery. And I think the root of that is what you said in the beginning, is that it's sort of like taking away yourself from it, right? Taking yourself and your ego out of the conversation so that if you are a servant that's working on a virus, a vaccination for a virus, or you are a servant that's helping people understand the connection between buildings and air quality in an urban environment, that you're doing that from a really rooted place.
Yep.
Thank you. Now, do you all think as religious leaders that we and other religious leaders could do a better job with getting the message out about the validity of science and helping? Scientists have, and I think this is a myth too, but a reputation of not being good communicators. Is it our responsibility as religious leaders, because we've all brought up the moral aspect of climate change? If we are the moral leaders, how can we do more to bring the issue of the crisis of the climate to more people from a moral perspective, and tying it to science? I just wonder how can we expand what we know to more people? And I'll just interrupt myself for a second, but Gerald, when you and I were talking several years ago, we were back there in Washington, and I turned to you and said, how are we going to get everybody on board? Because we were talking about the smoking connection, that once enough people understood that smoking causes cancer, they stopped smoking. But you turned to me and I said, we've got to get everybody on board with this climate thing before we destroy the earth. And you said, you don't need everybody. You need a critical mass, and that I should stop trying to get everybody, that in the civil rights movement, you did not have everybody. I think, was it 20% or something? But I do think we could do more to help the scientists getting this message out. So I've said that, and now I want to know, because at some point, pretty soon, we have to kind of wind this conversation up. And I wonder if each of you have something that you'd like to leave our audience with, a message that they can take with them when we sign off in a few minutes. I don't mind. If you don't want to do it, don't. And if you do, just put your hand up so I can see you. Okay, Melanie, you go first.
I'm glad to start jumping off from what you said. When Orthodox Jews first learned about Darwin, they didn't object. They said, wow, God can work in such a magnificent, complicated way. And I think if we could stop always pointing to this challenge between religion and science and see more that we may speak to different issues, but that can be complementary. That doesn't have to be an argument. I also would like to say that I come from a really old religion, so that having a broader time span, not thinking about, did I make a profit this quarter? What's the bottom line this year? But remember, in Psalms, 1,000 years are in thy sight as but a watch in the night. Having that longer time perspective would be such a gift to our society. We find that in Judaism. We appreciate that past generations have planted trees, and we enjoy their beauty and their fruit. And we have that obligation to do so for the generations that come after.
You just reminded me of the Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. But I think that the history of the Jewish religion is so important to this conversation too. William, you were going to say something, weren't you?
Well, I'm always happy to jump
Yes,
in.
you're going to.
It looked like Gerald had unmuted himself. I'm happy to say something, but Gerald, you unmuted yourself first.
No, I didn't unmute. Somebody else unmuted me. I'll follow you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, there's so much that's been inspiring to me from what you all have been talking about. I want to pick up on what Melanie just said, though. I think is really important that, there's been this rhetoric of, if we don't do it in 10 years, we're done. It's kind of apocalyptic rhetoric. And that was already starting in the 90s. But there will be future beings in 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, 1,000 years. And having a sense of our ancestors and the future beings, maybe even some presence of the future beings, that they are looking back at us and thinking about, are we going to leave them a world with clean water and good agricultural land and clean air? I think that's really important. I'm just finishing a long article on Buddhism and ecology, so there's a lot to say, but maybe I'll just end with this thought that I find personally helpful. And that is that, as I've been emphasizing tonight, one of the things I appreciate about what Buddhism can bring is a sense of practice. And that when we are dealing with either as activists or starting institutions or trying to make large scale change against what feels like intractable problems such as racial justice and all kinds of other inequities and white supremacy and climate change, that we need to take care of ourselves and build our own resilience. We need to feel like we belong in the world and have a sense of support. And it's not necessarily about being at peace or being happy or being relaxed. I think in a world that's crying out for our help, Buddhism certainly doesn't teach us not to feel any pain. Buddhism teaches us it's hard to resist the temptation of distracting ourselves from the reality of what's going on in the world. But living a life of practice, engaging these intractable issues, can lead to a degree of equanimity and peace with ourselves, even in a world that's so full of beauty that we love wildly, but it's in pain and we're not necessarily at peace with that world as it is.
Thank you. Gerald, I think you were going to go next.
Well, I was going to say that having been a university administrator, psychologist, and all those things, whenever and a pastor for many years, we've never, even now during the pandemic, we combine prayer with the medical profession. When I go into a hospital room or with families, we talk about what kind of medicines we're doing. We consult with the physician. We talk with the physician. So we respect what has been done from a scientific point of view. I don't think I've ever said, don't go to the doctor, don't listen to what they're saying. Let's pray about it, understand, to give the hope and work along with those in the scientific community. I do have a reservation about, let's make sure that vaccines have been proven before they try the guinea pigs as they did in the Tuskegee Project. Let's look at that when they were dealing with syphilis. But I believe that we can look at the scientific information, understand that they're going through all the particular trials and this kind of effort, and then work along with them. So that's going toward what you're saying, Sally. If we can get that information and let people know, if somebody's coming up to me with cancer and I sit down and say, well, let me pray so you'll be healed, I have some reservation about that. Let us join forces. That's what I was talking about with the communication of how we do. And I think the Union of Concerned Scientists, I think what they've done, they have two victories that I think are very powerful now. One of them is that they're shielding they're going to shield the government, where scientists now will not, scientists in the EPA do not have to be politicized, that they can have the kind of freedom to let the political, to let the scientific data go forth when we talk about at the EPA. And also they're saying that now even the EPA must be responsive to what the scientists are saying. So we're finding that the government and science is coming together, faith and scientists coming together, and then all we've got to do is get those profit mongers together, because the profit mongers are influencing the political and they're influencing other aspects. So when those all come together, we've got that communication that I talked about. So the Union of Scientists have already moved from doing something in the EPA. But from our point of view and those on others, we've always respected, and I think in many cases, respected the scientific developments that have worked toward the eradication of certain diseases.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Gerald. And Ibrahim, yes, leave us when you talk about what you're going to talk about, but then leave us with whatever it is you'd like our audience to have learned from you tonight.
Well, that's funny. I appreciate that. Well, I think, okay, so I think you just touched on it, just that one of the big pieces is that as we get into this era of planning for resilience and planning for what's going to happen with climate change and how cities have to make big decisions and coastal areas have to make big decisions, that policymakers have often missed the opportunity and missed the mark and not consulted with faith leaders. And I think that that's a big opportunity right now that we can really connect the dots on. I think another big point is that religion, science, business, politics, all of these things are talking about the end of the world in different ways. You just illuminated it on a little bit. They all have their own word for it. It's either like doomsday or it's whatever it is, whatever it's called. I think it actually is some part of it that is actually, we recognize that something is changing, that something is ending, that an old way of living, an old way of being on the earth is shifting into a whole new way, that we're shifting out of this extractive mentality where we took people out of places, where we raped human beings, where we raped the land and the natural world, and we're shifting into something where we heal people, we reaffirm people's connection to the land, to the natural world. And I think that that's the shift that we're making. We're in the midst of this transition from extraction to regeneration. So the thing that I want everyone to sit with right now is that what is your relationship to the natural world? And I would encourage you at the deepest level to go outside at some point in the next couple of days and see a vista, touch something in the natural world, have an experience that reminds you that you're connected to it. Don't just have this, mindset where you're figuring stuff out and writing and thinking and talking. Actually go out and experience and be in the natural world, and specifically go look at something beautiful, a sunset or a sunrise or the ocean or at the top of a mountain or the top of your building where you can just see the very little edge of the city. Whatever you can do, have that moment that's outside of yourself so you can breathe and exhale and remember that you're connected to it all.
Right. Thank you. I think that's beautiful.
And stay away from stereotypes. Stay away from stereotypes. We say scientists are nerds and religious people are holy rollers and all of these. Stay away from the stereotype because we all are in this together.
All right. But I think what you had to say, Ibrahim, is really kind of good news. And I totally agree, and I'm sure we all do, that if we can get out into nature, it not only improves our health, but it connects you to all this other part, all of the existence of the creation. And I want to leave you with just one thing that I heard, because I also think it's good news. John Kerry said, President Joe Biden will trust in God, and he will also trust in science to guide our work on earth and to protect God's creation. Our new coming in president. And that for me is very, very good news. Thank you to each one of you for the time we've spent and the fun of getting to know one another and having this conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Ken for a few minutes, and then we're going to sign off. And I won't be back on, so I'm just going to say thank you. It's been really fun. And Ken, it's yours now.
Well, what a great conversation. I want to thank all of you for your wisdom, for your eloquence, for your insight, for your passion, and for your commitment. About 500 people were with us tonight listening to this conversation. And, Helen Keller once said that science may have found a cure for most evils, but not for the remedy of one of the worst, the apathy of human beings. This is where I think leaders of the faith community are so essential. You exalt us, you inspire us, you get us out of our selfish, apathetic mindsets and call upon all of us to look at higher causes, to love one another, to love ourselves, to love our ancestors and our successors, and to love our planet. So what I hope from tonight is that everyone who listened to this program heard Reverend Durley when he said the soul of America rests in the environment. I hope that they heard Rabbi Aron, who said, we're all here enjoying the natural world because of the practices of our predecessors, and we owe it to our kids and our grandkids to leave that world in a good shape to them. I hope they listened to Dr. Edelglass, who talked about all of us becoming bodhisattvas and devoting ourselves to alleviating the suffering of others. And finally, I hope we all focus like a laser beam on the question that Ibrahim posed for us, which is how do we solve the age-old problem of clean water and waste and energy in a way that's better than we've ever done it before? So I think if we can be inspired by these leaders and focus on these questions, then tonight will have been a great success. And I want to say that the Union of Concerned Scientists will be there with all of you. I hope some of you are inspired to sign up and join our network, which you can find at www.ucsusa.org. So I want to thank again our wonderful speakers, and I want to thank the audience who I know listened to this great conversation, and I hope that they feel as inspired by it as I do. So thank you and good night.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.
Thank all of you. Nice meeting you. Good seeing you again. Salam alaikum.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.